Good evening, everyone. My name's Andrew Scattergood and I'm co-chair of Momentum and the FBU Regional Secretary for the West Midlands. Now, I'll be hosting this evening's rally for Labour's Socialist Green New Deal. Tomorrow, it will be 1 year to the day since the Labour Party conference overwhelmingly voted to support the motion for a Socialist Green New Deal. That motion was moved by Wrack, the Fire Brigades Union General Secretary, and supported by Labour for a Green New Deal. It included the ambition to achieve net zero emissions by 2030 by expanding public ownership across the economy, repealing all anti-trade union laws, implementing universal basic services, providing repatriations to the global south and creating millions of well-paid unionised green jobs. Winning the support of CLP delegates and trade union delegates from right across the trade unions, this was a moment of historic unity between the Labour movement and the climate movement around a socialist vision for climate justice. In the last year, Labour went into the 2019 general election with the most ambitious climate policies of any major party in Europe, but we experienced defeat at the ballot box. Jeremy Corbyn's leadership came to an end and Keir Starmer is taking the party in a different direction. But the climate crisis continues to intensify. You only need to look to the raging wildfires in California or devastating flooding in Senegal to see that. And the global COVID-19 pandemic has shaken economies and threatened livelihoods with a looming recession and employment crisis. We need a socialist Green New Deal more than ever. There has been no time more opportune for the Labour Party to promote our radical vision for climate, economic and social justice. Now, I'm delighted to be joined this evening by activists from across our movement who haven't stopped organising for a socialist Green New Deal in its fullest form. Now, I'm very honoured to introduce our first speaker, Scarlett Westbrook, someone who's far younger than me. And that's important, as we all know that the severe effects of climate change will be felt not by us, but by people like Scarlett. From organising her local climate strikes in the West Midlands to setting up a mutual aid group in Birmingham, from meeting with all Westminster opposition party leaders alongside many other parliamentarians with the aim of improving their climate and inequality policy, to even contributing to the first ever student written bill, the English Climate Emergency Act. She's been fighting for her generation and we are happy she's the first to contribute. Welcome, Scarlett Westbrook.
Thank you so much, Andy. Hello everybody, my name is Scarlett and I'm a 16-year-old climate justice activist with Labour for a Green New Deal Birmingham and spokesperson for the UK Student Climate Network, and I'm also head of political engagement and policy at the Teach the Future campaign. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you all today. In 2018, aged 13, I became the youngest person in the world to have an A-level in government politics, which I self-taught in 7 months. For this qualification, I studied environmental policy as an optional unit. And let's just say that I was and still am shocked at our country's appalling climate policy. From failing to meet the targets set out by the Paris Convention to scrapping the zero carbon home standards, the Tories have shown us exactly how they feel about the biggest crisis mankind has ever faced. Politics, by definition, is the process by which conflict is resolved. And there isn't a conflict more deadly than this. Yet this doesn't seem to be understood by some in Parliament. The West Midlands, where I'm from, as well as Andy, is commonly referred to as part of the Red Wall, yet not often in terms of the climate crisis. You see, people here have already lost their lives to climate change. From Yvonne Booth from Great Barr, who tragically lost her life due to climate change-induced floods earlier this year, to 9-year-old Ella Kissy Deborah, who sadly passed away in Birmingham due to inhumane levels of air pollution. Midlanders have their lives at stake, and it's not just from sky-high levels of poverty. Whilst politicians don't act, the people in the Red Wall are more and more likely to suffer from the disastrous effects of climate change. And while the death toll increases, the time we have left to change things decreases. You see, just like society, climate change discriminates. And just like hate crime, the current legislation we have in place to combat this issue is grossly inadequate. It's the people in the impoverished areas of the Midlands who will die from air pollution, the people in the Maldives who will drown, the animals in America who will burn, and ultimately, it will be our world that's destroyed. The climate crisis is an issue of social justice. From bridging inequality, the Green New Deal is also a policy that aims to bring this about. From bridging inequality in our own country by creating 3 million new green, well-paid, secure jobs, to retraining millions more so that they can make a just transition to working in a carbon zero economy, to paying back our colonial debt to those countries in the global south, where the scars of colonisation mean that their current economic capacity to deal with the climate crisis that we, the global north, have disproportionately contributed to, will be stunted. For too long, it's been the people who constitute the very fabric of our society who've been ignored. Our workers, our young people, our ethnic minority, queer and disabled communities, and we can't let this continue. The Green New Deal will decarbonise the UK through a 10-year government-led mobilisation, end austerity, protect and restore vital threatened habitats, all whilst keeping workers at the forefront because they are the backbone of society. It also means reforming our education system to make it centre the climate crisis in every subject, because whether you're a builder or a banker, you'll be impacted by this catastrophe's effects. And it involves breaking down existing access barriers so that we can have an education system that works for all, not just those who are privileged, middle class and neurotypical, so that we can build a resilient society that has all of the skills and knowledge needed to deal with the now inevitable impacts of the climate crisis. The Green New Deal will put in the infrastructure needed to prevent more people dying from floods and pollution and heat waves and hunger and poverty right on our doorstep and pave the way to international aid. It's a policy developed by the people, for the people, and with the people at its heart. And by that, I don't mean fossil fuel executives, but people like trade unionists, school strikers, activists, and more. It will restore democracy's dictionary definition of power of the people. This is more than a policy, it's a lifeline, and it's vital that this new leadership commits to this vision of an internationalist, worker-centred and intersectional Green New Deal. In these unprecedented times, we can't forget about the climate crisis, because lives, including those of our electorate, are at risk. We need to change our newfound rhetoric of going back to the so-called glory days with going forwards to a livable future, forwards to social and climate justice, and forwards to a Labour government. We steered forward the Industrial Revolution, and now it's time for us to do the same with the Green Industrial Revolution. It's time for climate justice and a Green New Deal now, and it's time for our leadership to act and push for that. We don't want your words, we want climate action. And as someone in Generation Z, we may be the youth of today, but we can't have you steal our tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Scarlett. That was a fantastic opening contribution to our meeting this evening. Now, our next speaker is Chris Saltmarsh. Chris is a co-founder of Labour for a Green New Deal and has led on their campaigning and organising strategies. He played a pivotal role in the run-up to and at Labour Party Conference 2019, among other things, in getting the Socialist Green New Deal passed. He's also chair of Oxford and District Labour Party, and he's writing a book for Pluto Press about climate justice, which is due out in September 2021. Chris, welcome to our meeting.
Thanks very much. Comrades, it was 1 year ago tomorrow that Labour for a Green New Deal joined forces with Momentum, FBU and other trade unions to achieve something unprecedented. As Andrew said before, we unified the climate movement and the Labour movement around a radical plan for a socialist Green New Deal that included the ambition to decarbonise this country by 2030. I was sat outside the longest compositing meeting in Labour conference history, and I was sat on the balcony above conference floor when all of those hands went up supporting the motion for a socialist Green New Deal moved by Wrack. That was the moment that we all knew that Labour would be going into the next general election with the most radical plans to tackle the climate crisis of any major party in Europe. So how do we do that? Well, we articulated a socialist climate justice politics that made clear there is absolutely no conflict between workers' justice and climate justice. In fact, the exploitation and precarity that workers experience has the same root causes as the climate crisis. That's our capitalist economic system and the profit motive, which drives wages down and drives oil, gas and coal companies to extract and burn the fossil fuels which are heating our planet. So with an understanding that climate injustices are a symptom of the class war that is being waged by the rich against the poor, we could put forward a framework for climate action which rejected eco-austerity, rejected any notion that it was workers and ordinary people who had to sacrifice to tackle climate change. It was the power and the wealth of the capitalist class that needed to be curtailed, and any lifestyle changes would be about improving everyday lives, creating a society of communal luxury, and making the greenest choice the cheapest and the easiest. So 1 year on, we need the core elements of a Socialist Green New Deal now more than ever. The climate crisis is intensifying, and the COVID pandemic that we've been dealing with over the past months has caused a looming recession and a crisis of unemployment. Our Socialist Green New Deal pledged to meet everybody's basic needs with a programme of universal basic services, guaranteeing access to energy, housing, healthcare, education, transport, food, broadband, emergency services. Because we can't achieve an economic mobilisation on the scale of a Green New Deal without those basic needs being met. And there can be no climate justice if we stop emissions, but working class people are still hungry, homeless or housing insecure, socially isolated, or in fuel poverty. Our Socialist Green New Deal committed to expanding public ownership across the economy. And now, more nationalisations aren't just nice to haves when a socialist is leading the party, because democratic ownership of the economy is absolutely crucial to tackling the climate emergency. The Prime objectively unequivocally failed to make any progress in transitioning the economy to bring down emissions and adapt to the impacts of climate change that we are already locked into due to historic emissions. So while certain members of the shadow front bench are already suggesting that Labour might renege on even the basic nationalisation commitments from the 2019 manifesto, rail, mail, energy, broadband and water, what we actually need to be doing is fighting to expand those commitments, to expand our plans to bring sectors of the economy into public ownership. Because that's the only way we will have a centrally planned democratic transition to a new economy, to a clean energy economy that is as fast as possible, that ensures justice and prosperity for workers and communities abandoned by neoliberalism. The private sector and the free market, they prioritise profits for the same capitalist class that has gotten us into this crisis. But a democratic, publicly owned economy can help us manage a transition that puts people and planet first. So over the next few years, we need to be crystal clear with this Labour leadership that the Green New Deal policies of the 2019 conference and manifesto are not even radical. We can't afford to dispense with them. They are the bare minimum for tackling the climate and economic crises that we face in a way that is just for this country, but also for the rest of the world to whom we have obligations. And in fact, we need to push those policies further. So as we experience the effects of this pandemic, and as we lose valuable time with these Tories in power to tackle the climate crisis, Labour has the choice to prepare to lead a last-ditch attempt, a huge economic mobilisation for climate justice from 2024 or whenever the next general election is, or Keir Starmer's Labour can be complicit with the Tories in being the midwives of devastating climate justice with economic injustice consequences on a scale that our civilization may never have seen before. That's the choice that Labour faces. And I know which side I'm going to be fighting on over the next few years. And I know which side Labour for a Green New Deal, the FBU and Momentum will be fighting on too. I very much hope you'll join us.
Thank you, Chris. Again, fantastic contribution. And for those of us who were at that conference, it was a great day for us to, make those gains, but a reminder that 1 year on, how much work we've got yet to do. So our next speaker is Gaya Sriskanthan, who was elected alongside myself and others in the recent Momentum NCG elections. Now, we both proudly serve as co-chairs of Momentum and have made tackling the climate emergency a top priority for Momentum. Gaya brings a unique perspective on this matter, as she is also involved with Democratic Socialists of America and has worked on international climate action for many years. And I'm really looking forward to her contribution. Thanks, Gaya.
Thank you, Andrew. It's so great to be here with all these incredible leaders working towards the Green New Deal from both sides of the Atlantic and from different movements. This is really emblematic of the kind of action required to genuinely take on the climate crisis. We need to be working across every sector and different movements to join the dots between the multiple crises that we face in society. At Momentum, we see our role as being to help our members take on these threats to their communities, acting from the grassroots to the political level. One of Momentum's priorities will be fighting for a just and green recovery from COVID, and a Socialist Green New Deal will be a critical part of that. We understand that the housing crisis, the cruel reaction to the pandemic by the government, austerity, and the climate emergency are all parts of the same story. One about a system that is rigged to sacrifice the many for the interests of the few. And without tackling that, we cannot solve these interconnected problems. One of the strongest features of Labour's Green New Deal is its understanding of this and its focus on redressing the balance of power towards the public and workers and acknowledging the problem of inequality, both inside the UK and with the global South. The climate struggle is class struggle. Our plans must reflect this by addressing the global inequality and injustice, which will see countries in the global South hit hardest by the climate crisis. Responses to this could include cancelling debt and taxing the wealthy in order to pay climate reparations for Britain's historical contribution to global emissions. It must include committing to resettle climate refugees who will be forced to flee their homes due to floods, fires, and droughts. A key feature of Labour's Green New Deal, as Chris mentioned, is public ownership. We know that private sector efficiency is a myth. In the UK, our experience with National Rail shows this. Contrasting the NHS with the expensive, cruel, and massively inefficient private health service in the US couldn't make the point clearer. The false logic that the market can fix everything hasn't worked for climate change either. We are still on track to well above 2 degrees warming. There is no clear pathway under the current system to accelerate action at the rate needed to avert catastrophe. They have no plan, and it's up to us to speak truth to power and push for real solutions. We know we have to look for answers where the needs of the many are prioritized over the interests of the few. Nationalization and democratic public-led planning will be essential to achieve this at scale. And as we push for public and collective ownership within the UK, we need to support the rights of people in the global South to also use the potential of their public sector to plan for both the vicious impacts of climate change, as well as to transition to a cleaner future. Just as austerity continues to devastate the UK's public services, citizens in the global South are also subjected to brutal regimes of austerity by monetary institutions. They are forced to honour debts made by unscrupulous lenders, often big banks based in the City of London, and they are told to raid the public purse to pay back this debt, often at high interest rates. As a result, some countries are forced to cut public expenditure by up to 30 or 50%. That's money that would save lives if invested in health services or climate adaptation. The pandemic has only heightened this debt crisis. If debt was forgiven and responsible lending enforced, these countries would be able to invest in protecting their citizens from the climate crisis and to transition to a just green economy. Instead, they are forced to depend even more on the unsustainable extraction of natural resources to service their debts. To add insult to injury, many countries are rich in natural resources, but investors in North America and Europe own the companies that extract this wealth. They take all the value out of these countries and use tax havens in places like the Cayman Islands to dodge paying their fair share. This adds to the spiraling pattern of public purses being drained. We have the resources to bail out the banks when they gamble away their money, but there is no political will to forgive the debt of poorer countries. We have to challenge the role of the governments of the UK and the US in this, and to take on big financial institutions that are propping up global debt systems. We need to challenge their complicity in imposing harsh austerity abroad and in shielding systems of tax evasion. Debt traps, austerity, and tax evasion may not seem like it, but they are all core climate issues, and we need to build a new culture of climate activism around them. If we do not solve this, we will not be able to unleash the potential of the public sector globally to take on the climate crisis at the scale needed, and the global South will continue to shoulder the bulk of the burden of the climate crisis. Our struggles are joint and our enemies are common. The Green New Deal has to be global in scope or we'll all fail together. We need to show unity with people in the global South and speak out when our governments act against their best interests. We must build a new understanding of what climate activism means and build solidarity with anti-capitalist movements in the global south to really create a Green New Deal that is global and just. Thanks everyone for listening, and I'll now hand it back to Andrew.
Thanks, Gaya. Thanks for another great contribution to this evening. Now, our next speaker needs little introduction, an author of 4 books, including The Revered Chavs, The Demonisation of the Working Class, and his new book is being released, I believe, tomorrow, titled This Land, The Story of a Movement. He's also a journalist and a passionate advocate for class-based climate policies. Welcome to Owen Jones. We can't hear you, Owen.
Am I on now? Can you hear me?
You're on now.
Fantastic. Sorry about the slightly unconventional surround. I'm sitting in the middle of a street to talk about this absolutely pressing issue, which is, of course, the existential threat posed to humanity by the climate emergency. And firstly, I specifically want to praise the FBU, who have been at the absolute forefront of pushing the Labour movement to take the climate emergency seriously, both as the existential threat, as I say, to human existence, but also as an opportunity to transform our societies and create a socially just and green world, which is what we're fighting for. And it's so important to emphasise when we're talking about how capitalism is at the epicentre of this crisis. As the Canadian political economist Jeff Mann put it to me, if you begin from the premise that climate change isn't solely attributable to capitalism, it's definitely inseparable from it. The form of climate change we face, he tells me, is unthinkable without taking capitalism into account as a fundamental driver. It's the incessant, of course, imperatives of profit, of expansion and growth, which are hardwired into the very nature of capitalism, while the defenders of what I suppose we would call hyper-capitalist ideology claim the market's best place to rationally allocate resources, which environmental crisis underlines. It simply isn't true. As the Carbon Majors report found in 2017, 100 companies are responsible for 71% of the world's greenhouse gases in the last 30 years. Worth emphasising that. 100 companies responsible for 71% of the world's greenhouse gases in the last 3 decades. There's another problem too, of course, under capitalism. There are privately owned fossil fuel companies with huge resources, money and power, and through lobbying and political donations, they wield vast influence within political elites, blocking the action needed to save the planet from destruction. You can see this in, it's very acute, I suppose, in a place like the United States, where you get these vast lobbying industries, these huge lobbies, very well connected lobbies, and the more money, of course, comes into play into politics. And there was a study a few years ago that suggested that the US wasn't, and this was a Harvard study, couldn't be rationally called a democracy, but rather an oligarchy, partly because of the role of those lobbying organisations, including climate movements. And now it's worth, of course, emphasising we don't transform, challenging capitalism is a matter of human existence, the survival of civilization as we know it. We have now 10 years to keep global temperatures from rising up 1.5 centigrade above pre-industrial levels. And to achieve that, we'd have to slash human emissions of carbon dioxide by 45% in 2030 compared to 3 decades before. Now, as the UN Intergovernmental Panel Socialist consensus on its findings, but the mainstream economists and political figures would accept this, it would require rapid and far-reaching transitions in energy, land, urban infrastructure, including transport, buildings and industrial systems. That radical transformation has never been achieved on that scale or even close in the history of the human race. And of course, if we don't, just a 0.5 degree more will mean extreme heat waves, droughts, floods, rising sea levels, threatening low-lying coastal areas and small islands, the irreversible loss of the Greenland ice sheet, the mass destruction of algae, fish, insects, plants and animal life, and the near total destruction of coral reefs. Communities dependent on agriculture or coastal livelihoods would be particularly badly hit, while poverty and disadvantage projected to dramatically increase. And that's why that class dimension is so important. We know, of course, through every crisis that those at top, the powerful, the rich, they protect themselves, they defend themselves, they always have the welfare state of the rich and powerful, those networks to protect themselves and immunize themselves from crises, which they, of course, then expect those who don't have that power to pay the price instead. Now, the difference, and I'm sure this may have already been talked about, but in terms of what we're up against, the difference between 1.5 centigrade and 2 centigrade temperature rise could reduce the proportion of the world's population suffering water stress by 50%. And we already know those droughts are forcing population movements. We know in terms of, those droughts, the impact of that, those extreme impacts in terms of war and conflict. I remember a few years ago, I can't remember who, someone mentioned on Question Time about the horrific Syrian civil war and how it began by those fleeing the countryside because of climate-related extreme drought, going into the cities, not having opportunities, unrest growing, and that obviously precipitating the horrors of what happened with the response to the Syrian regime. So in terms of what we do about it, you can't leave this to the market, the chaos of the market. We need a planned response, which puts human needs and the future of the planet is very core. And what we're arguing for isn't to reduce people's living standards, it's to improve them. If we have public ownership of transport and dramatically modernise and improve it and make it affordable, then we'll stop people using as cars as much, but we will also, of course, at the same time, improve people's living standards, because we know that the disaster of privatised rail, rip-off, inefficient, and the impact that has on the economy. If we had public ownership of the energy companies, then we could, in terms of democratizing energy, having local communities in charge of it. If we have a mass insulation program of homes and businesses, we'll create jobs. And if we look at other countries like the United States, fascinating statistic, 80% of internal flights are between cities and towns on the where people go take a plane either between towns up and down the East Coast, up and down the West Coast. And that's obviously in the case of the United States, the lack of a proper rail system that's affordable and accessible. And one of the pillars of the AOC Green New Deal is to have that massive expansion of rail. And what we can see in this country as well, particularly outside of major cities, is a rail system which simply isn't functioning. So if we have this public ownership of rail, of energy companies, then what we could do is use that to transform society, create jobs, improve people's living standards. We know the impact of pollution on health, particularly of people who are poorer. By greening our societies, we'll improve the air that we breathe, and that will particularly benefit those with other underlying health conditions who tend obviously to be poorer, and the coronavirus crisis has underlined how underlying health conditions collide with other health crises. So we've got to, what this shows and what the coronavirus crisis shows, we should see this as a dress rehearsal. The coronavirus crisis underlined existing injustices and exacerbated them. We applauded those key workers who are undervalued and underpaid. It underlined how millions are one pay packet away from poverty. It shows that the welfare state is inadequate, that private tenants are at the mercy of their landlords. But it also shows that the state wants to intervene on a mass scale, it will and it can. And that's what we've got to argue for now. We've got to have a massive state intervention, public ownership, democratise the economy, and improve people's living standards. Because ultimately, as we can see, the climate emergency is the offshoot of capitalism. It's not the automatic. It can't be separated from capitalism. And ultimately, if we want to build a society globally that's sustainable and just, then that means confronting capitalism itself.
Thanks, Owen, and thanks for taking time out of your bike ride to join us.
I mean,
this
we're
meeting.
sitting here on a computer in a street. Anyway, cheers, everyone.
Thanks very much, Owen. Right, our next speaker, and talking about international solidarity and the fact that climate change doesn't recognise borders, and therefore neither should we. Our next speaker is Kate Amanoff, who is a fellow at the Type Media Centre. She's the co-editor of We Own the Future and author of The New Denialism. Her writing has appeared in The Guardian, Rolling Stone, Harper's, In These Times and Dissent. We are looking forward to hearing her perspective and how we need to work across borders to fight for climate justice. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you so much. I was lucky enough to be with many of you in Brighton. Hopefully we can all be together in person sometime in the future. You know, unlike then, Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders seem a bit farther from power than they did a year ago, but reality has been making the case for the kind of bottom-up democratic, socialist, egalitarian movement politics that fueled their campaigns ever since. So California is on fire, hurricanes have been crashing into the US, millions of people are unemployed, and there's of course a pandemic that our right-wing governments have handled with murderous incompetence. More than 200,000 people have died from COVID-19 in this country alone, thanks in no small part to our for-profit healthcare system that we should all fight to make sure it doesn't leach its way into the NHS. Business as usual just isn't an option anymore. And you know, for those of you lucky enough to not follow US energy politics, our last Democratic president had an energy strategy he described as all of the above. Basically, that means that coal, oil, and gas were all good so long as we slapped a few solar panels and wind turbines on top of it. Climate science has gotten even more dire since Barack Obama left office. And we know that that's not true. We know we can't afford an all of the above strategy on energy anymore. We need to get off of fossil fuels as soon as possible, reach net zero emissions by 2030, kneecap the power of the fossil fuel industry, which, as Owen just said, just infects our politics and really has fashioned the US into something that looks a lot more like an oligarchy than a real democracy. And we need a real democratic low carbon economy that's built firmly in the public interest and to serve the public and not a few new green profiteers who, whether it's ExxonMobil or Tesla or Elon Musk, are just out to make a profit and really aren't interested in the types of changes we need and need to be firmly regulated. So I think that those of us pushing for a socialist and well-planned Green New Deal of the sort that you all have led on in the UK can really take, by contrast, an all of the above approach to movement politics, the kind of movement politics we need to win it, to fight for state power at every level of government, particularly important in our case where Republicans control a gross number of state governments, to take to the streets in a socially distant way, of course, for now, to challenge the murderous incompetence of our racist and xenophobic right-wing governments, federal governments in particular, and to challenge the corporations that they work for. I mean, particularly in our case, where fossil fuel money is just ubiquitous in our politics. And there's never been a more important time, particularly relevant to this call, to connect the fights for a socialist Green New Deal on either side of the Atlantic. And to be fighting across borders for a really global Green New Deal that works alongside and takes up demands that our comrades in the global South have been making for decades, which Gaya spoke to, for not just rapid decarbonization in countries that have built their wealth off of fossil fuels, and in many cases from the theft of land and labor from the global South, but also for debt forgiveness and for climate reparations, for governments like the US and the UK to pay their fair share of what's owed. So I'm excited, to see Sunrise and Labor for a Green New Deal, trade unionists in the US and the UK, Momentum and the Democratic Socialists of America, and left-wing MPs, Labor MPs, and the small but growing every year, growing group of left-wing congresspeople here in the US, to see all of those folks continue to work together to win the type of Green New Deal we need and to make it as powerful and as ambitious and as well-planned as we know we need it to be. My entire job is spent reading incredibly depressing studies and statistics about climate change and climate politics all day, and really nothing makes me more hopeful than to see the fight for the Green New Deal keep up, on either side of the Atlantic and around the world. I mean, 1 year ago in Brighton, course, seems like a lifetime ago right now. I've also been thinking a lot about 2 years ago, when the Green New Deal was still a fringe idea, was something talked about by academics and people who really followed this stuff. And if they were talking about climate change at all, politicians here in the UK, we're talking about what level of carbon tax they might put on fossil fuel companies at some point, maybe if they agreed to it, if they really wanted to. But thanks to the work of the Sunrise Movement, to Labor for a Green New Deal, to politicians like Jeremy Corbyn and to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a Green New Deal, an ambitious, massive Green New Deal, big climate policies at the scale of the crisis are the standard by which climate policy is judged against, and that's no small victory. So I hope that looking back on this Zoom conference 2 years from now, hopefully surrounded by comrades, hopefully in person, we can look back and see all the hopefully positive change to be made in out of this moment of crisis, when we really need to be thinking big and how to transform what our governments do and who they serve. So I hope we can keep working across borders to get the leadership of our very reluctant opposition parties to take up the kinds of policies we need to confront capitalism and to take up the Green New Deal and really fight for it. So just very grateful for all of you and to be included on this call.
Thank you so much, Kate. And I think we would echo those sentiments about working together across those borders and building on what we've achieved so far. So thanks so much for joining us. Up next is Aaron Bastani, who is co-founder and senior editor at Novara Media and has a doctorate from the University of London. His research interests include new media, social movements and political economy. He is the author of Fully Automated Luxury Communism, which was a welcome addition to the political discourse. This book outlined the salience of the climate crisis whilst offering a vision of a new kind of society. Aaron, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. And for anybody watching, don't hold it against me that I have a PhD. Doesn't mean I talk complete gobbledygook. I just want to say the first person that spoke, Scarlett, obviously everybody that's spoken has been fantastic, but it really is inspiring. And I don't want to use that word lightly. I try to use it judiciously because everything is apparently inspiring in 2020. But it really is inspiring to see such a talented, intelligent, eloquent young person on these issues. And of course, it's a hackneyed phrase to say in politics for 100 years that, the next generation will win the battles we fail to win. But partly that's true because many of us won't be here as climate systems breakdown really comes home. And so I really think it's fantastic that when we look at various climate activists passing the baton on from generation to generation, that the inheritors like Scarlett are just so wise beyond their years. That's very uplifting, Scarlett. Thank you for being you. I'm very glad we're having the conversation. I'm very glad that we're also commemorating the fact that a year ago there was a remarkable piece of policy adopted by the Labour Party, which was driven from the bottom up, and it really could have changed Britain and perhaps would have had global consequences. We'll never know. Perhaps it still will. Before I carry on, I just want to very quickly say what's happened in regards to climate change since then, in the last 12 months. How bad are things getting? This year, Siberia hit an all-time record, 38 degrees centigrade. We've seen record ice melt in the Canadian Arctic. We've seen consecutive days above 40 degrees in Japan. We've seen in January, approximately 3 billion animals die in wildfires in Australia. We've seen in California, potentially 5 of the 10 worst wildfires in history. And we've seen far, far more, of course, ongoing decimation of the Amazon. But the big story, and it's very widely under-discussed, is, of course, COVID-19. COVID-19 and what it's done is inextricable from the story of climate systems breakdown. Now, this might sound like a reach. This might sound like I'm a climate Cassandra trying to bridge completely disparate and distinct problems, but that's not true. COVID-19 is the third coronavirus we've seen in the 21st century. The first was, of course, SARS. The second is called MERS. This is what's called a case of zoonotic spillover, where a pathogen goes from one species to another. There are a bunch of reasons that may happen. Almost always it's through ingestion, entering the food chain. Now, why is this increasingly happening? Why are we seeing 3 strains of the coronavirus so far this century? Well, it's because we're encroaching increasingly onto the habitats which were previously untouched by humanity. So through a combination of deforestation, decimating biodiversity, animal agriculture, globalization as it exists under market capitalism, all of these things mean we're increasingly seeing these terrible pandemics, and they'll only get worse. The coronavirus, COVID-19, has a very small fatality rate, but of course, we're finding out it's very difficult to deal with. But thank goodness its fatality rate is less than 1%, because it could have been Ebola with a fatality rate of 50% and had the exact same characteristics of being asymptomatic, perhaps in a large number of people, or maybe having a long period of sort of gestation before it appears. If that had been the case, we would have seen something like the Black Death that afflicted Europe after the 1340s. Thankfully, we haven't. And what's interesting is you hear politicians now, one person I never thought I'd hear this from your neck of the woods, Andrew, John Speller, talking today in Labour List, a stalwart of the Labour right. I don't agree with him on a single thing. And he's saying that the coronavirus, COVID-19, is here to stay with us. You know, we have to work out how we're going to live alongside it. Now, to me, that says herd immunity. And I obviously don't agree with that. But on the other hand, it's good that we're hearing some exception and admission that this is now the new reality. And what I'd want to say to people like Mr. Speller, or people who are actually very critical of the politics we probably all share to a general degree, is that this is the first wave of a sea of pandemics in the 21st century. There are 3,000 distinct coronaviruses among the bat population of Southeast Asia. And we think probably about several hundred break the species boundary, that humans may also suffer various ill consequences. This is just one kind of virus. And when I say on top of that, that we're going to see probably as much as 99% of Southeast Asia's bat population displaced as a result of deforestation, primarily in places like Indonesia and China. Why? Because of growing soy, coffee, beef, and so on. Then all of a sudden you start to think, wow, we're going to see 5, 10, 15, 20 COVID-19s. And so all of a sudden, this is a very serious problem for people who otherwise completely disregard climate change. I saw a member of the Labour shadow cabinet going to open up a new terminal in Manchester Airport, saying, I can't wait for us to go back to how we were before, and people travelling all over the world. That ain't happening. And so one thing I would like to say is that while many of us may feel down with great justification, the Tories are in charge, the Labour leadership seems to be going in a very different direction to where it's been going. All the statements you're hearing, all the policy announcements, all the general colour of politics is kind of meaningless, because we are only, as Keir Starmer rightly said, in the foothills of a very, very significant crisis, which I think increasingly large numbers of people will understand as situated within the climate systems crisis more broadly. So what do we do? I've said 2020, as we all probably agree, I'm preaching to the converted. 2020 has been a horrendous year politically, but also in terms of what it means for the climate, in terms of various examples of how things are clearly getting worse. What do we do? The first thing is, knowledge isn't power, but it's pretty close. And increasingly we have some amazing books out there, podcasts and so on. David Wallace Wells wrote a great book last year, The Uninhabitable Earth. And I would say that's the kind of book that you need to be putting into people's hands as frequently as possible. If you have, somebody's birthday coming up and you say, what should I get them? That's an opportunity to educate them about the big crisis of our time. Similarly, buy copies for libraries, for schools, and so on and so forth. That's one simple thing. Secondly, you obviously need to join the Labour Party, or you need to get other people to join the Labour Party and make very clear, yes, it's great if you're doing your ethical shopping. It's great if you want to one day buy an electric car or use public transport. You don't use plastic bags. That's fantastic. But ultimately, we can only drive real change here at the level of the state, right? That's how we got in this mess. That's really the only way we're going to get out. And to do that, you're going to have to join a party of potential government. That ain't the Greens. And I say this is somebody who wants to see proportional representation and a more democratic electoral system in this country. you join the Labour Party, you get involved in Green New Deal activism locally, and you try and drive policy change. You also run for local office, potentially as a councillor or potentially as a PPC, and you put climate change politics front and centre of what you're doing. And when you do so, you hook up with people like Scala, who are incredibly passionate about climate change. They might not necessarily be coming at this from a party political perspective, and you build that broader coalition. And while things might not look great today, if we start doing that, by 2030, we're going to have a very formidable movement, both in Parliament and in the streets, but also in local councils, local workplaces, to really address climate change. Now, I finished with this. That sounds good. It sounds like a plan, but as we all know, we haven't got that long. We all know we haven't got that long. So we need to accelerate and expedite that as much as possible. We know we're probably going to go above 2 degrees centigrade, and that's something which is a bit of a bottom statement in the climate movement. It's highly likely we're already going to see catastrophic climate change this century. But that doesn't mean we don't advance the policies which mean adaptation, which centre the global south, because that's what adaptation is fundamentally going to have to mean, looking out for the global poor. And I'll finish with this. Often in the last 5 years with Corbynism, people say we have to appeal to people's sense of self-interest. Well, that's absolutely true. We should obviously do that with climate politics too. But Clement Attlee, ahead of 1945, put it very succinctly. He said the point of socialism is not to appeal to people's lowest instincts, but their highest ones. And I can't think of a higher instinct than preserving our planet for future generations. So I think we have a good idea of what we're doing. And let's be real, the achievement of last year really was a milestone, and I look forward to many more.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks for that contribution. And I think there's one thing we definitely share in common, which is that we don't agree with John Speller on anything. And moving on to MPs that I do agree with, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our next speaker, Zarah Sultana. Before becoming an MP, Zarah joined the Labour Party in 2011 and 2019 for Coventry South. She made an immediate impact and defied convention by utilising a maiden speech to attack the Tories' record and decried 40 years of Thatcherism, which caused expected uproar from the usual culprits. Moreover, she also highlighted the impending climate crisis that we are facing. Zarah, as part of the Socialist campaign group, is fighting hard to push for a Socialist Green New Deal. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome her. Thanks, Zarah.
Thanks, Andy. And I'm so sorry I was late. I'm sorry about the messy background. Things are still in boxes. Ever since we got the office, we just haven't got around to unpacking a lot of things. But I just wanted to say it's such an honour for me to join all of you this evening and to be speaking alongside such a fantastic group of speakers. I'm sorry I missed some of the earlier speakers, including Scala and so many others. There were votes this evening in Parliament on quite a shocking bill which the Tories have brought forward, and I'm going to touch on it briefly because it gives a good indication of where we are in Parliament. So the bill, called the Overseas Operations Bill, brought in, because it's now passed, a supposed triple lock against the prosecution of soldiers, including against prosecutions regarding war crimes, torture, and crimes against humanity. Liberty, the human rights organization, said that it effectively decriminalizes torture, as do lawyers and even former senior military officers. I voted against it along with a number of socialist campaign group comrades, as did the Lib Dems and the SNP, but sadly it sailed through. And I'm mentioning this for a couple of reasons, because firstly, it shows the priorities of this Conservative government. We've seen other legislation brought to the House that targets migrants. We've seen the reheating of old debates with the Internal Market Bill. And from this, we can deduce that the Conservatives want to keep these so-called culture war issues central. They don't want us to be talking about their failures in dealing with the coronavirus pandemic, the fact that we have the worst death toll in Europe, that we have one of the deepest recessions in the OECD countries, the fact that, you know, we could be talking about economics, inequality, poverty, or the climate crisis. And, you know, this is a clear tactic that they're deploying. And while we can't avoid culture war, after all, these are questions of minority rights, the vulnerable and the persecuted, and we absolutely have to fight for those rights and champion these causes. We can't let these debates monopolize the debate. So we have to force issues of class, of poverty, and of course the climate emergency into the debate as well. And that brings me to the second reason I mentioned the bill tonight, because sadly it highlights our power is not in Parliament right now. In the fight for climate justice, we do need to fight, and we do need to fly the flag as high as we can in Parliament. And I will do that at every opportunity that comes before me. It was central to my maiden speech. I've spoken on the issue multiple times, and I proudly put my name to the climate emergency bill a couple of weeks ago. But I know, we all on this call know that this fight can't wait. So we need to build our strength out in the streets, in our communities and in our workplaces to force the change in Parliament and across the country. We have seen U-turns happen all year long. We've seen it happen in this summer. And that shows that while the Tories have this 80-seat majority, people in our communities can force that change here. So no more tinkering around the edges, it's radical change that we need. And like I said in my maiden speech, we need to be honest about what the climate crisis is. It's a capitalist crisis. Capitalism caused it. It definitely cannot solve it. Only our politics, our socialist message of hope and unity can unite people and bring about a society that puts people and planet first, not profit. And this moment, politically, economically, historically, shows that our message is needed more than ever. The coronavirus crisis has exposed inequalities like never before, highlighting also the rot at the heart of our economic system and the contempt that this Tory government has for working people. Like I mentioned before, we have the deepest recession on record and the highest excess death toll in Europe. And that's why we need to be clear about our alternative. It's not just talking about competency, it's not just a more competent alternative, it needs to be a socialist alternative, it needs to be a socialist government committed to a global Green New Deal, a deal that rewires our economy. It creates more than 1 million good unionised green jobs, with everything from retrofitting homes to make them more energy efficient and lower bills, to building the green technologies of the future, investing in a public transport system that's free and available to all. And part of this has to be taxing the billionaires and the fossil fuel giants. They created this crisis, they need to pay to fix it. So I guess it's an understatement also to say that it hasn't been an easy time, not for new MPs going into Parliament, but also all of us. But we have no time to despair. So solidarity, comrades, and let's fight together for that better, brighter socialist future.
Zarah, thank you so much for that contribution. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us on this meeting. It really is appreciated. Now, it is a great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Amy Ramirez. The Sunrise Movement is a nationwide effort led by young people to stop climate change and create millions of good jobs in the process. They're building an army of young people to make climate change an urgent priority across America, end the corrupting influence of fossil fuel executives on our politics, and elect leaders who will stand up for the health and well-being of all people. Like Scarlett, our next speaker, Amy, is a young climate activist fighting the good fight. Thanks for joining us, Amy.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Firstly, I just want to say how grateful I am to even be a part of this event. I think that the international focus on the Green New Deal is key to big win for all of us, because this challenge is something that we are all facing together. Being in this space brings me so much hope that we will get policy and legislation change for the betterment of our communities and world. In the US, we are much farther behind, so it can be really demotivating to continually feel like we're losing time, losing precious leaders like Bernie, and losing lives to the climate crisis. It still boggles my mind that we as youth activists have to explain to politicians and corporations why this is the biggest issue of our lifetime, and all of our policies and legislation should be centered around fighting climate change. I admire and look up to this movement and what you have produced in the time that you all have been organizing. We as activists from other areas of the world look up to you all so much. You all have been bold in your call to action, and we know that identifying the intersection of environmental racism and economic inequality is crucial in making sure we create fair and just Green New Deal policies. The fact that you all can clearly point to capitalism as a detrimental factor in the climate crisis and look to people power and working class support as your backbone is amazing. I am hoping that sometime soon, socialism will stop being seen as such a dirty word in the United States, because I know that it would bring so many more people together if we called out capitalism for its negative impact on our society. You all really represent a working class movement that is so encouraging. It's even more encouraging to see so many youth rallying behind this issue, because we know that we have more at stake. Our livelihood and our futures are at risk if our leaders do not act now. There is no time to waste, which is why I'm so happy to be joining hands with all of you in this fight for action towards a Green New Deal for all of us. Something that I'm hoping to take away from these sessions and bring back to my hub at Sunrise is your all's drive and consistency. We need to keep fighting and driving our leaders to work for us, even when it's hard, even when we are tired, and especially when we have suffered a loss. Like you've said, we are facing fires, storms, and floods that we can't hide away from. Our ecosystem is hurting and our homes are suffering. But the fight continues because, as I said, our lives depend on it. I have a 5-month-old right now, and I want to be able to tell her that everything I did was to make her life cleaner, safer, and healthier. If our leaders aren't listening to us now, we make them listen. We elect new leaders and we raise new leaders. Our future is not a game, and our journey towards the Green New Deal is a path that we are not alone in. Thank you all so much for the work that you do to organize for a fairer, greener planet. We are in this work together, and I am so happy to unite with all of you.
Thank you so much, Amy, for joining us, and real inspiration to sort of hear the stuff that you're focusing on over the other side of the Atlantic. And thanks again for joining us. Now, our next speaker, or our last speaker in this case, is Matt Wrack, who is General Secretary of my union, the Fire Brigades Union. He was re-elected for his 4th term as General Secretary last year. Matt is a strong, passionate advocate for class-based climate politics. As I mentioned earlier, he moved Labour's Socialist Green New Deal motion last year at Labour Party conference, and the FBU was proud to work with Labour for a Green New Deal to achieve that. It showed how CLPs and trade unions can work together to push for radical policies. He was recently quoted in a BBC article on the climate crisis saying that swapping to paper straws isn't going to save our planet. So I'm hoping to hear more from Matt on other things than straws. Welcome, Matt. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Andrew, and good evening, comrades. And I have to say, it's been a fantastic event so far. It's been really inspiring to hear the other speakers and to see so many people coming along to join us in this absolutely vital discussion. And a number of people have touched on the issue of COVID, and we face a global crisis regarding COVID as we struggle to come to terms with this scale of destruction that we've seen from the pandemic. And again, highlighting very clearly for us as a public service union here in the UK, whose members are going above and beyond to try and save lives and to help others in other public services keep our communities safe. We see the impact of austerity policies in undermining public services. We see the impact of privatisation. We see the utter failure of this government and other governments across the world to plan, despite the fact that they had warnings going back in the UK as far as 2008 in terms of the UK's National Risk Register, warning precisely about the sort of pandemics that we are now facing. And while we come to terms with the COVID crisis, of course, the climate crisis continues to unfold before us. And it means, as people have pointed to, horrific extreme events, floods, droughts, heat waves, pollution, and of course fires. And I think correctly people have pointed to the fact that it is the poorest, even in the richest societies, the poorest and workers who suffer the most, here in the UK and indeed all across the world, with the global south suffering far more than we do in the advanced rich economies. In the fire and rescue service, internationally indeed, this is already an industrial issue. And I'll just give a couple of examples. In the UK, in my time in the Fire and Rescue Service, it is noticeable the increased number of extreme flood events that we have had to deal with. And yet, again, a symptom of the failure to address these issues. In England, there is no, the Fire and Rescue Service responds to incidents of major flooding, but there is no statutory requirement to do so. And the reason governments don't provide that, don't give that statutory obligation on fire and rescue services, so that they can avoid providing the necessary funding to provide the boats, the equipment, the dry suits that are necessary to tackle such major incidents. It's also an industrial issue for our brothers and sisters across the world. I think most notably in the rich countries, if you look at the United States and at Australia, and in fact, just looking at my own union's magazine over the past year, you can see our front page headlines, one dealing with fires in the United States and one dealing with the bushfires in Australia. And we have very close links with our sisters and brothers in those countries. And I used this example at the Labour Party conference debate last year. But in 2013, the Yarnell Hill fire in the US, we saw 19 firefighters killed in a single incident. Those were trade union members of our sister organisation, the International Association of Firefighters. I think very much highlight, and even in the most powerful, wealthiest country in the world, workers, trade union members, have put their lives on the line tackling incidents which are directly related to climate change. We had visitors from Australia earlier this year explaining the huge challenges that had been faced in terms of the destruction from the unprecedented level of bushfires in Australia. And again, people may not have picked up on this, but in California, we have indeed the use of convict labor to fight wildfires in California. Prisoners being paid $1 an hour to volunteer to go out and fight the large-scale wildfires in California and elsewhere. So for us, this is an international discussion within the fire rescue service, within the firefighting profession, a very immediate challenge to us, and one why we are very proud to engage with sisters and brothers in other countries, and with young people in particular, who I think perhaps see more clearly than others the threat from the climate catastrophe. And we're very proud to work with them here in the UK and across the world. And many people today don't necessarily know what a trade union is. And I think there's some skepticism about the role of unions. And I'll come on to that in a moment. But certainly this union is very proud to champion the case for radical change, for radical policies to tackle the impending catastrophe that arises from climate change. A number of people have touched on the link between this issue and political economy, capitalism. We say that it's a class issue. What we mean by that is twofold. Firstly, that the sections of society which will be most immediately and adversely hit are the working class and the poor across the globe. But there's another aspect to what we mean by a class society. It also means that there is another class in society, and that's the class that owns and controls the majority of the resources, wealth, and means of production. And in reality, when decisions are made about investment, when decisions are made about energy production and so on, ordinary people in Britain or anywhere else across the globe have little or no say in those at all. And it's already been expressed the power that those corporations have in lobbying and influencing governments all across the rich countries of the world. So that's the other aspect in which climate catastrophe is indeed a class question. There's another issue which we're dealing with as a union, which again in microcosm highlights this challenge, and that's in relation to the Grenfell Tower fire, where again you see decades of deregulation, decades of political decision making that says actually we can leave these issues to the market. We can leave these issues to businesses because they will act rationally. And what we find is that those businesses do everything to cut every possible corner, even if that means putting effectively petroleum around a building that people live in. In Grenfell, that resulted in more than 70 people losing their lives in a single incident. On the global scale, in terms of climate catastrophe, it will mean the loss of millions upon millions of lives unless we tackle it. So that's the scale of the challenge that we face. I think it's why we say, and we were proud in that discussion last year, a fantastic debate at Labour Party conference last year, to put the need for public and social ownership at the heart of this discussion, because the market will not solve, most obviously in terms of some of the issues that have been discussed this evening, public ownership of transport, the need for public housing, and a whole programme of building new homes for people, decent homes that face the future in terms of energy efficiency and so on. And perhaps most notably, the need for public ownership of energy. And I have to say that we need this done on an international scale. The idea that Britain can resolve this, or the United States can resolve this, or any individual country can resolve the climate catastrophe alone is frankly nonsensical. And what we see, in many ways, people see the idea of internationalism as an ideal. Well, actually, internationalism in this context is the most practical solution to a catastrophe facing us all across the globe. So internationalism in this day and age is not idealistic. Internationalism is absolutely essential. I wanted to just make a comment about unions, because at that Labour Party conference debate, there was some disagreement. There were people arguing for more cautious approaches. There were people expressing concerns about the threat to jobs in certain industries and so on. And those are real concerns that we have to address. But if I can use an analogy, we wouldn't, for example, defend the death penalty so as to keep people who build scaffolds in work. We want people in jobs, we want people in good quality jobs, and therefore the socialist element of a Socialist Green New Deal is saying we aren't out to destroy jobs, we want to build new jobs, new industries for the future. And across the world, millions upon millions of new, high quality, highly skilled, trade unionised jobs with security and with decent pay. That's what the prospect of a Socialist Green New Deal offers to us. And think about some of those deindustrialised communities that Labour is debating around in terms of the so-called lost red wall seats. That could offer hope to people whose communities have been devastated by the loss, for example, of the coal mining industry in Britain, or the steel industry, or shipbuilding and other traditional heavy industries. So we have to engage in this level of debate. I think we have to say to Keir Starmer that we do expect him to stand by his election pledge, to place a Green New Deal at the heart of everything that Labour should be doing. I think we need to raise the sights of people to say that actually what we're aiming for is the interest of all humanity. That's what we're fighting for. And I just touch on something that was mentioned earlier, not about appealing to people's narrow self-interest, but appealing to the best of people. And I'll just give, we're living through, we've seen the international phenomenon of the Black Lives Matter campaign, which I think has struck a chord all across much of the world. And it's been fantastic to see multi-ethnic, multiracial protests of young people across the United States, North America, and much of Europe as well. And there are some fantastic traditions here in the British working class movement. Of the first mass petitioning was of workers in northern industrial towns against the institution of slavery. Something that they probably had little understanding of, but nevertheless said, actually, we don't support that, it's not in our interests. Or if you read some of the comments of Confederate diplomats in Britain, arguing that Britain should intervene in the American Civil War on the side of the Confederacy, were baffled by British workers and British trade unionists who said, actually, we side with the North because we want to see the destruction of slavery. And they couldn't believe this because they said this isn't in their self-interest because the loss of cotton is putting them out of work. So we appeal to people's higher ambitions, higher principles. And we say that that at the heart of that is the need for internationalism, for democracy, for justice, for social ownership. And socialists at the end of the 19th century coined a phrase, I think most famously, although not firstly, Rosa Luxemburg, the choice we face is socialism or barbarism. I think that's the climate catastrophe puts that very starkly in front of us. That's the choice that we face. And I choose socialism as the answer to climate catastrophe that puts working people here and across the world in the driving seat to make rational decisions on behalf democratically of all of us. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Matt. And I think we can clearly see why Matt was re-elected for his fourth term as General Secretary. Fantastic General Secretary, not great at keeping to his speaking times. But anyway, thanks so much to all of our speakers this evening, to everyone on this call for coming along. I think we've heard loud and clear that Labour needs to be promoting our Socialist Green New Deal now more than ever. That's a Socialist Green New Deal, must be internationalist at the core. Expand public ownership across the economy, repeal all anti-union laws to unleash the potential of workers in this country, create millions of well-paid and unionised green jobs, and make sure everyone's basic needs are met with universal basic services. These aren't just red lines for our movement, but for the climate and the millions of people who stand to benefit from the investment and economic transformations of a Socialist Green New Deal. Our victory at Labour Party conference 1 year ago was historic, but the political conditions are changing and we need to keep up the fight as much as ever. To keep up the fight, you can join Momentum or the Labour Party for a Green New Deal today. Let's keep fighting and demand a Socialist Green New Deal. Thank you to everyone who's joined us tonight in solidarity.